Good morning and welcome to our panel today about protecting our democracy and right to vote. My name is Kim Rogers. I am the Executive Director of the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State. And today joining me, we have Vanessa Gonzalez, the Executive Vice President of Field and Membership Services from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We have Raymond Pertolin, the National Field Director at Asian and Pacific Island America Vote, also Apia Vote, if I shorten that. And we have Rebecca Carruthers, the Vice President of the Fair Election Center. We're going to start off today doing some intros with each of these folks joining us. We're going to talk to you a little bit about what their current jobs are, their personal stories, and how we got to where we are and why these issues are so critical. I think folks tuning in understand that voting rights are under attack across the country. We've seen more than 500 bills in the states trying to restrict access to the ballot. Nationally, Republicans have blocked every single attempt to pass the For the People and Freedom to Vote Act, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Republicans have been working to gerrymander, dilute, divide minority voters, and outright try to prevent many from voting at all. This has been specifically targeted Black, Latino, Indigenous, Apia, and immigrant communities are specifically targeted. And, never before has our democracy felt so fragile. You're going to hear from some folks who are doing the work on the ground. And with that, I would love to hand it over to Vanessa. As I mentioned, Vanessa is at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She has served as the outreach. She served in the Obama administration of outreach engagement for Department of Education. She also worked with the Planned Parenthood Federation of America and has worked as a therapist in Arizona as well. She has a long history of working for Governor Napolitano and held various campaign positions as well. In addition to her role at the Leadership Conference, she also sits on the board of Inclusive, a nonprofit that works, that staff and consultants and vendors of color are found at every professional level within advocacy, policy, and campaigns. Vanessa, I would love to hear a little bit about your personal career story and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kim, and thank you for having me today. Apologies on the voice, but I have my little handy cup of coffee next to me. So yeah, again, all of those things that you listed, it's so funny to hear it read back sometimes because it's very different. So my career trajectory is definitely not, I think, what most people in Washington, D.C. would describe as the traditional direction that I've taken. I've done the Hill. I've worked in campaigns. I think in last count I did 12 campaigns under my belt, and I've learned from every single one of them. I am proudly about to be 44, and so I look back at my career as such that I've done some pretty good stuff. I will say that when you think about policy and politics, for me, it was really important to continue to always have a grounding in what I was working on, right? And so one of these weird little hiccups that people always ask me about in my resume and my career is that I did leave politics and I left DC for about 8 years. I was in Arizona, and after I worked with Governor Napolitano, I stepped away to go to grad school to become a social worker. And I was a social worker primarily for new arrivals. I did children's mental health from 0 to 5. I was able to work in the foster care system. It was really eye-opening, humbling. I continue to carry a lot of the family stories with me as I do my work. And then at one point I decided, okay, I've gotten all this experience. I'm still angry. I know that policy and politics is one of the best ways to make the most change for the most people. And so combining all of these things, I thought, okay, it's time to go back. I was told often, you've been gone way too long. Like, do you even know anybody back in DC? Do you know anybody in campaigns anymore? And I thought, yeah, I don't care. Because what was important to me was that I was bringing a really personal and necessary experience to the work and the conversation. And so I will say that being a social worker for those years in Arizona now essentially sits at the core of how I move through the rest of the work, including the work in building out state programs and relationships with organizations in the ground to secure voting. Because if we can't vote, all of the other things start to crumble. And that includes particularly the support that we're giving families, right? And so I always think about my foster kiddos that I had the chance to work with and those who are adopted, and what that really looks like.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing the story. It's always so interesting to hear the career paths, especially when it is not your traditional linear path. And it's really refreshing to know that there's more than one entrance into this political space. With that, we're going to go over to Raymond. Raymond Pertolin is like I mentioned, the National Field Director at Apia Vote. For almost a decade, he's been an advocate for immigrant and refugee communities. Prior to being at Apia Vote, he was also at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta. There, his team led the charge to register over 1,000 new voters. And that's where Raymond and I did some work together when I was over at Everybody Votes. He directly engaged with thousands of historically underrepresented Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders to defeat anti-immigrant legislation at the Georgia State Capitol. He's a coalition builder and played a key role of the establishment of the Georgia Immigrant Alliance for Civic Empowerment. He's well known in the media, particularly in bringing the challenges faced by communities of color into public eye. And he was named to one of the most 25 influential Asian Americans in Georgia in both 18 and 19. And this is the fun fact about Raymond. He's an avid musician and has won 3 Grammy Awards for his work on a jazz album, American Dreamers, Voices of Hope, Music of Freedom. Raymond, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your personal journey to where you are today?
Yeah, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction, Kim. It's truly an honor to share this virtual stage with you and the other distinguished panelists. And I'm really excited about this conversation today because, as you alluded to, Kim, as we end another year and move into 2022, there's a ton that's at stake for our democracy. And it's on all of us, those of us on this panel, those of us watching in the audience, to do what we can to protect democracy and our right to vote. So as Kim mentioned, I currently serve as the National Field Director at Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, or API Vote for short. We're a national nonpartisan organization that's based in Washington, D.C. And just as you can imagine, our mission is to increase civic and electoral participation among Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders all around the country. So a little bit about my career journey. I'm a proud Filipino American. I was born in the Philippines and came to the United States with my parents at the age of 1. And as you can imagine, I have zero recollection of my birth country. And because of some legal complications that I'll get into in just a second, I've never returned. After arriving in the US, my family worked really hard to make a decent living and to make the US our permanent home. But when I was 10 years old, my family and I became undocumented. When this happened, my mom told me never to talk about my immigration status with anyone because telling the wrong person could result in our swift deportation back to the country that we left so long ago. At the same time, I didn't really understand what it meant to be undocumented. And as I got older, it became clear to me that being undocumented would have a significant impact on my life. Because in high school, my friends were getting their driver's licenses, starting their first jobs, thinking about college. And because of my immigration status, something that I had absolutely zero control over, I couldn't do any of those things. And I was devastated. And coupled with the fact that I couldn't talk about the issues that I was dealing with, I found myself in a really dark place. In my junior year of high school, I actually tried to take my own life. And I'm truly grateful that I survived because that was the moment in my life that pushed me to step outside of my comfort zone and start seeing myself as an advocate for other people in similar situations as me. And I decided that I'd do everything in my power to serve the immigrant community so that people in my position would feel supported and seen. So that takes me into my career. For years, I watched as the DREAM Act, a bill that would provide a pathway to citizenship for me and for millions of other undocumented young people around the country, was debated in Congress, and it was never passed. And it was difficult being in a place where I felt like the people in Washington were making decisions about me without me having a seat at the table. And so I truly started to organize to survive. So in high school, for Obama's first election campaign, I organized my first voter registration drive, and I started to use every opportunity that I could to share my immigrant story and humanize a policy issue that was and continues to be so abstract for so many people. Then I went on to college. I ended up going to college on a full scholarship, where I was later elected to be the first ever Asian American and undocumented student body president on my university campus. And that's when I realized that I had a knack for elections. So after college, I went on to work at Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta, where I led and managed our civic engagement programs. And in 2016, we were successful in registering over 11,000 new Asian American voters, and we helped the triple Asian American voter turnout in Georgia compared to 2012. And the last thing I'll say is, over the last couple of years, in addition to my work full-time working at nonprofits, and recently in the private sector, I've also worked as a consultant on numerous political campaigns at the local, state, and federal level, various 501c4s, independent expenditure campaigns, and political action committees. And finally, after the Atlanta spa shootings earlier this year, I decided that I needed to return to the space that made me who I am, which is the Asian American organizing space. So I left the law firm that I was working at, and I accepted an offer from Apia Vote to serve as its national field director. And so here I am today, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to continue serving immigrant communities in a truly impactful way.
Thank you so much, Raymond. That is, I appreciate your willingness to share your personal story, and we're so glad to have you here today. And thank you for your fight. We also want to take a moment to introduce Rebecca Carruthers, Vice President over at the Fair Election Center. Fair Election Center is a national organization that focuses on voting rights. Rebecca has worked on political and government projects all across the country through a variety of experiences over the last 20 years. She has managed and consultant campaigns, voter projects, and with candidates in over 24 states, including presidential and down ballot races in battleground states. Ms. Carruthers has worked on several national organizations, including Move On, Everytown for Gun Safety, the National Democratic Training Committee, Equal Justice Works, and the National Network for Arab American Communities. She's worked on Capitol Hill with Congressman John Dingell on the Affordable Care Act before moving on to become a director of a lobby shop at an energy trade association. Her network includes elected and appointed officials at every level, business executives, trade associations, grassroots coalitions, and community organizations. Rebecca, would you like to tell us kind of a little bit more about that very remarkable career path and how you ended up where you are today?
Thank you, Kim. So about 20 years ago, when I was 20 years old, I was interning in the local mayor's office while I was in college. While I was there, I was recruited to run for a local office. Being 20 years old, I knew nothing about running for office, so I said yes. So I ran my campaign out of my dorm room. I didn't know anything. All I knew was to show up where potential voters were. So on the weekends, I would go knock on doors. I would show up to churches. I would show up to a variety of events in the community where I was running. I also didn't know how to raise money. I think in that campaign, I might have raised like $300 because I was too scared to ask strangers for money. So I beat someone in the primary, but I lost in the general election. And what I learned, it doesn't matter the amount of passion that you have to run for office, but you have to understand the business side of running for office. So that led me to the last 20 years of working with a variety of candidates all across the country, working for different organizations, including super PACs and the local and state parties, because I really wanted to teach candidates, this is how you run for office. These are the practical skill sets and things that you need to know. And it's not about just being passionate about the reasons of your why you're running for office. So one thing that I've discovered during the last 20 years, all of the money that I help raise, a lot of the money that I help spend, if there aren't true and meaningful voting rights protections in our country, it doesn't matter. And so that led me to joining the Fair Election Center, where we focus on ways to make sure through impact litigation, through helping to support elections administration, through our Campus Vote project, where we make sure that students understand their right to vote and how to register to vote through their particular institution. It's the reason why I'm where I'm at now, because the right to vote is so sacred in this country, but it must be protected if we want our democracy to continue.
I could not agree more. And because Amy Pritchard told me to, I'm going to take a personal privilege moment as moderator and tell a little bit about myself. I often joke that I was born an organizer. I have 3 brothers that I grew up with. And sometimes just getting to watch what you wanted on TV or to get a second helping at dinner, you had to organize your way into it. But at a very young age, I saw a lot about justice. I grew up in very rural, poverty-stricken part of Iowa. I went to a school where we were I think we were 100% free school lunch and breakfast. And so you didn't realize you lived in poverty because everyone did around you. And I had this wonderful community where, the different farms bartered, and, we would give folks a side of beef, and then we would get dairy from another farmer and eggs from the chicken farmer. And so I grew up in a community that stressed the power of collective power and the importance of taking care of each other. And at a young age, I was entered into a National History Day competition, and that was talking about personal freedoms. And the precocious 7th grader that I was, I had just read a story in 17 magazine about Becky Bell, who had died because of a botched abortion because of parental consent. So in 7th grade, I did a presentation on parental consent. And I didn't know what abortion was until I'd read that article and started becoming an advocate, and thought it was really unfair that a woman died just because she couldn't talk to her family and have the access to the health care that she needed. I had some health problems in high school, and my family had a lot of financial struggles because they had to pay for surgeries for me. And I decided one of the ways that I could help fight back was to advocate and get people elected who would help continue those fights. And so I worked in candidate and political politics for the first 10 years. I dropped out of college to work on a campaign in Iowa, and kind of continued to drop out of college repeatedly to do that. I did finally finish, thanks to a very kind boss who said you needed that piece of paper and allowed me to go to school while I finished the campaign. But when Tom Vilsack dropped out of the presidential race in 2008, I went over to work for Rock the Vote and got to get into the democracy and really activating young people when I was still kind of young back then. And when that was over and Obama won, I went full-hearted into working for passage of the Affordable Care Act with Change That Works. That introduced me to the labor movement and the power of the collective. And I had the pleasure of working with UFCW and NEA. I started one of the biggest voter registration organizations. I've done some consulting. And now, given all of the challenges that we're facing across the country, like Rebecca was saying, one of the truly uniform and foundational to every single issue we care about, whether it's abortion, whether it's gay marriage, whether it is education, if we do not have foundational, fundamental access to the ballot, we cannot change any of those other issues. And we continue to see that right now. And so I am now working at the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State because I believe that the secretaries have the last line of defense so often when it comes to these voting rights. And because I think a lot of these fights are at the state level, particularly while Republicans can continue to filibuster and block any access at the federal level. With that, I know there's some questions in the chat, and we'll get those in a bit. Just wanted to also give our panelists a chance to talk to you a little bit about their specific organizations that they work with. On this, Vanessa, would you like to tell us a little bit about the leadership committee and if there are any of the job opportunities there?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. And thank you all for sharing your amazing stories. It's so nice to hear the personal journeys. And it's amazing. So thank you. So I work for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We are the country's oldest and largest civil rights organization, founded in 1950 by some of the giants of the civil rights era. And so we very much continue to work in their vein. We have been engaged with every civil rights piece of legislation, voting reform, since 1954. And so we are very much involved in what's happening now. So in particular, we kind of call the table, if you will, right? So within our leadership conference of over 230 member organizations, and it's all national organizations, we run the gamut of issue areas, of constituency, concentrations, you name it. And so it's really an opportunity for us to act as the conveners to really bring these different folks together. So for example, reproductive justice is something that we are engaged in, and we're able to do it from a civil rights lens, right? So when people see that the leadership conference is engaged in the abortion fights, they know very much that we are going to be coming at that from the communities most impacted. And that's always how we lead. And so we will go and we filed amicus briefs at the Supreme Court. I had the privilege to speak at the last SCOTUS rally. I would prefer not to have to speak at SCOTUS rallies about all of this. It would be great if we never had to have them again. But so we engage at every level, whether it's at the courts, legislatively, whether it's grassroots, grass tops, you name it, we're going to try to be in there and to be as helpful as we can. Now, because we do have such a big national footprint, as in my role as field and member services, I try to be really mindful that when we do engage with states, we never Bigfoot. And so we always think about, okay, how can we be supportive of existing campaigns, of existing measures and existing work? And that's because we wholeheartedly believe that the people closest to the problem are the people closest with the solution, right? And so we work with folks to say, okay, what works in this state or works in this community on a particular issue, whether it's ballot initiative, whether it is some school district shenanigans, we want to make sure that we are following their lead. And it's very interesting when you start to combine the national and the state work together. So when you think about all of the issues around gerrymandering that are happening right now, particularly in Texas, right? The Texas case is one in particular. When you think about our work, what we're able to say is we have been pushing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act forever and a day, it feels like. And when that is not passed because of partisanship, what happens is you get states like Texas, who are going into redistricting, have gerrymandered areas with some really precision on the kind of communities that they want to disenfranchise, right? It's no surprise, I think, to anybody. And so what we're able to say is without the protection that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act provides, this is going to happen all across the country, and you're taking us back to the 1950s and 60s, and right. So we're able to provide that kind of perspective because of our voice and because of our history in the work, and make sure that people understand this is not new. It may feel new to some folks. Folks may want to romanticize the civil rights fights of previous decades, but it's very much with us now. And so we're able to try to move people to engage in a way that is modern, but also calls back to the history and the lessons learned. And so at the leadership conference, we are expanding a bit. We have definitely grown in the last 2 years or so. And in that growth, we have looked at, okay, we need to We need to hire a couple more field organizers. I told y'all I had cold medicine, sorry. We need to hire a couple more field organizers, right? We are definitely looking for either field organizers, people with law degrees, because we do, like I said, we do file those amicus briefs and we will work with state partners. And so we want to make sure that we hire experts in those specific issue areas. And we work on all kinds of issue areas, like I said, but in coalition with our 230 members. And so while they also have their own folks who are also experts in their field, it's a nice kind of layer in to make sure that when we say this is a civil rights issue, when the leadership conference has something, it also helps add in another layer of speaking for the civil rights community writ large. And so up and down, we are right now thinking about how do we make sure that we have advancement opportunities and stretch opportunities for more junior staff who are looking for those. They may be younger in their career, right? What does that look like? We also have definitely removed things like, needing a college degree because that is just not needed in all of these professions that we're hiring for. And what we really want to value is the experience and the eye and the vision that you bring to the work. I will say personally, having worked in the reproductive health world, having worked in policy and campaigns, this is the most diverse staff I've ever worked with. All of the leadership are people of color except for one, and majority women. And so it's really been interesting to look back on my days in the progressive movement when people were supposed to be advocating for policies, but not actually living them. And so I feel really, really, really happy and I feel at home to be in a place that the leadership looks like the communities we're fighting for. And when I bring up an issue that maybe if I had brought up before in a different organization, I would have been kind of shut down. But in this space, we can have the conversations, and we have conversations on race, we have conversations on privilege and poverty. And so it's also a place where it's a good learning place, but you get to jump in, and if you fail in a project, you get to fail with safety and security. And so it's just a nice learning place. And we are always good about pushing people out of the nest. We feel like we welcome all kinds of folks, really want you to get some learning. And then if you leave us, we hope it's with a good experience.
Great, thank you so much. It's always so nice to hear about that kind of workplace, and just really happy to hear all the work that you guys are doing. On that note, we're going to kick it over to Raymond to talk a little bit about Apia Vote, and given what's going on in the chat, would love to also hear a little bit about what you all are doing in redistricting as well.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, happy to talk about Apia Vote. So Apia Vote was founded in 2007 with a vision to increase civic engagement among all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders around the country. And as I mentioned earlier, as a national nonpartisan organization, we view our work in terms of partnerships. We work with local and state-anchored community-based organizations to mobilize APIs in electoral and civic participation. And our goal is to reach every eligible Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander voter, because it is only when all of our communities are seen and heard that we can truly address these really important issues that face our community, like anti-Asian hate, and uplift the needs of our NHPI, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander sisters and brothers. And at the core of our culture is the need to train and empower APIs to have the skills, network, and experience to help their communities engage civically and have their voices heard. Our work begins with deep consideration for diversity, equity, and inclusion to ensure that all of our communities are represented and considered in all of our efforts. And this focus becomes more important as APIs continue to grow, diversify, and the organizations and volunteers that serve them also evolve to meet the needs of these new and growing communities. We also value building and maintaining mutually supportive coalitions with other historically disenfranchised Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And every member of our staff and board is committed to our vision for a fair, inclusive, and collaborative world. So on the redistricting side in particular, Apia Vote has been working tirelessly this entire year to host trainings for our partners all across the country. I'm happy to share that that this year we were fortunate enough to have trainings happen in 12 different states, where we went in, we identified a group of partners that was super engaged, super ready to roll up their sleeves and get to work on the redistricting process. And we hosted these trainings to help inform people about, one, what redistricting is, two, why it matters specifically for the API community, and three, why it's important for us to engage with the redistricting process in a very collaborative way with other communities of color. And at these trainings, we'd also train folks about how to effectively draw community of interest maps, and then how to present those maps and how to advocate on behalf of their communities to the redistricting authorities, like the redistricting commissions and the legislative committees that are handling redistricting in so many states around the country. And it's been truly inspiring to see how much engagement and interest there is among AAPIs around the country to participate in the process. And it's really important for folks to understand that redistricting is something that we all have to care about. Everyone has a role in the redistricting process. It doesn't matter if you work at an organization like I do, or the other folks on this panel, or if you work in the private sector, if you're just a person in the community that cares about your neighborhood. Everyone has a role, and it's really important for everyone to get involved. And it's also important for people to understand the relationship, the connection between redistricting, all of the census advocacy that so many of our partners and other organizations did in 2019 and 2020. And finally, connecting all of that to the general voter engagement work that we all do year in and year out. All of it is connected. And like some folks are saying in the chat, I'm watching this really dynamic discussion that's happening right now. And I love it, because I love seeing people who are so passionate about our democracy and protecting it. It's important for people to recognize that in order for us to continue ensuring that our communities' voices are heard and that our communities are seen in these decision-making spaces, we have to encourage people to vote in every single election. And not only that, we have to encourage people to get counted in the US Census every 10 years, and we have to encourage people to participate in the redistricting process. So with all of that said, API Vote is also in the process of expansion. I appreciate you for sharing, Vanessa, earlier about all of the opportunities that are available at the Leadership Conference. It's really inspiring to see the organization grow and for you to value diversity, equity, and inclusion in your hiring practices. At API Vote, we're hiring for a number of positions. I'd encourage folks who are interested to check out our website at www.apivote.org to see all of the positions that we're hiring for. Specifically, we're trying to grow our capacity on the development side with a new development associate. We also are looking to hire a person to support all of our programs, a program associate, and we're trying to expand our team of youth coordinators to help us accomplish our mission as it pertains to Asian American and Pacific Islander youth. And the last thing that I'll say is just very recently, API Vote has taken a number of strategic steps in order for us to have a larger role in the policy advocacy arena, especially as it pertains to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Recently, we hired a senior policy advisor who has been monitoring various developments all around the states, especially in the areas of voter suppression. Kim alluded to this earlier. Over 500 bills have now been introduced all around the country that would curtail the right to vote for so many historically disenfranchised communities. And it's important for us to fight back against these measures. And at the same time, it's important for us to push for positive legislation in the United States Congress that would expand and protect the right to vote for all people. And so I hope that people in the audience will consider joining API Vote in this journey. And if folks have any questions about the positions that we have available, I'd encourage them to reach out to me at any time. I'll go ahead and drop my email address in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raymond, for all the work that you and API Vote are doing out there. With that, want to kick it over to Rebecca so we can hear a little bit more about fair elections, the work you're doing, and I'm pretty sure you all have something to do in the redistricting process as well.
Thank you, Kim. So the Fair Elections Center was started in 2006 as the Fair Elections Legal Network and was started to provide legal support around elections and elections administration. But since then, it has expanded, it has grown, and we'll be talking about the 16 or 17 positions we're going to be hiring for this year. 7 of those are permanent positions and 10 of those are cycle positions for 2022. We are nonpartisan. We are a 501c3. There's 4 major things that we do at the Fair Election Center. So we provide elections administration support for local and state election administrators, meaning that we've done a lot of research and we provide lots of support on best practices for administering elections. So we provide that support. We work with lots of secretaries of state as well as local election folks. The second thing that we do is called workelections.com. We recruit poll workers. As you all noticed in 2020, a lot of poll workers who work the day of the election or during early voting, it tends to skew older and whiter. And so we wanted to make sure that we were diversifying that. So with workelections.com, we did a lot of work with recruiting during 2020 because of the pandemic. A lot of traditionally older poll workers didn't want to work the polls during the pandemic. And so we also co-founded and powered Power the Polls. That's a brand a lot of people are probably familiar with. And we recruited, I think we recruited over 900,000 folks. And these are people who have never worked as poll workers before. So it was really great. A lot of election administrators really enjoyed that help that we were able to provide in 2020. The third thing that we do is impact litigation and advocacy. We do everything with making sure that returning citizens, convicted felons who are returning to their communities, who are now eligible to be able to vote. We work and we do lawsuits. We do all sorts of things to make sure that their rights are being restored. We also make sure that students' rights are uplifted on college campuses. We've seen, as of September 2021, all of the hundreds of voter suppression bills that were introduced in 2021, including over a dozen that were actually enacted into law. Some of these new voter suppression tactics that are now law severely impact students, does everything from removing precincts that were previously on college campuses and remove those things. So we do a lot to support immigrant communities, those who have been traditionally disenfranchised, returning citizens, as well as students through our impact litigation. And with advocacy, we advocate on both the federal level and state level. We definitely have done a lot around the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, as well as For the People. We're still hoping that there's enough pressure on Manchin, since Manchin now owns this, as a way to actually pass meaningful voting rights legislation within this Congress. The fourth thing that we do is through our Campus Vote project. Currently, we are in 10 core states, which is Arizona, Texas, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Virginia, where we have 10 state coordinators. We have a coordinator in each of these states, and they work with at least 25 college campuses in those states. And we place on those campuses what we call democracy fellows. These democracy fellows work with their campus administration and faculty to make sure that the Higher Education Act is being followed, which says if a college campus is receiving federal funding, they have to make sure that students have opportunities to register to vote and also are aware of when elections are occurring. So to that end, we help institutionalize registering college students on campuses. So some universities, when a college student is registering for class, a little pop-up shows up on their computer screen asking them, hey, are you registered to vote? If so, here's an opportunity for you to register to vote. Sometimes our democracy fellows are allowed to go into classrooms and to plug and talk about voter registration on these these campuses. So for 2021, we were on over 300 college campuses, impacting about 4 million college students across the country. So outside of our core states of 10, we are also, we do work with in about 41 states. But what's exciting about our Campus Vote program, our Campus Vote project, is that we're also doing a deeper dive with the minority serving institutions that we do work on. And so to that end, we're starting to take a deeper dive with our HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. So we now have uplifted an HBCU program, and we will be hiring in the first quarter an HBCU coordinator to work with our national HBCU manager. And so we're going to look at colleges and universities in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, in addition to the core states where we're currently doing work, to make sure that we're engaging with these campuses in meaningful ways, because we saw between 2012 and 2016 that there was a decrease in Black students' voter participation, predominantly white institutions, by about 5.3%, but in HBCUs, that decrease was by 10.6%. So we wanted to understand why, so we knew that we needed to do a deeper dive. So our HBCU program is proof of intentionality that we're willing to dig deeper within different demographics of students. So to that end, as we're lifting up our HBCU program, we're also looking at ways to deepen our work with other minority serving institutions, making sure that we're drilling deep into Latinx students, as well as API students and Indigenous students as well. So I mentioned we're going to be doing lots of hiring. And so right now we are hiring for another attorney to join our litigation and policy team. That's on our website, fairelections.org. We also have our North Carolina state coordinator, which will be based in North Carolina, working with those, I think it's 26 or 27 institutions that we're currently on in North Carolina. We're actively seeking and hiring for that. I think Monday or Tuesday, we're going to have 3 new postings, and that's for deputy state coordinators. The deputy state coordinator role is just for February through the end of 2022. They're non-permanent, but they are full-time. We're looking for a deputy state coordinator in North Carolina and Georgia, as well as in Texas. In second quarter, we're going to be hiring deputy state coordinators in the 7 other core states. Also in the first quarter, like API Vote, we are expanding our development teams. We will also be hiring for a development associate. During first quarter, we're going to be hiring for an HBCU coordinator, as well as an executive assistant. I'm the vice president of the organization. My boss, Bob Brandon, the president. We really need an executive assistant to really help us keep up with all the work that we're doing. And the development associate, the HBCU coordinator, as well as the executive assistant roles, those are all permanent. The opening for a litigation attorney, that's a permanent role. And the North Carolina state coordinator role is also permanent. Really fast. I also saw in the chat that there's questions in regards to redistricting. So this year with our Campus Vote program, our Campus Vote project, we added redistricting fellows. The reason why we did that, a lot of times when we talk about redistricting, we think of communities of interest along racial lines, but communities of interest also include college students. Mm-hmm. So after the 2010 census, the North Carolina legislature decided that they were going to split North Carolina A&T in half. For those of you who aren't familiar with North Carolina A&T is a HBCU, historically Black college or university. They decided they wanted to dilute the power of those Black students' votes. We also see in Florida, we see that Florida State and Florida A&M, they're right across the street from each other, but we see that those political lines are drawn to split those students to dilute their influence in Tallahassee. The difference between those universities is that FAMU is a HBCU. So we noticed that institutions institutions where we have high numbers of minority student enrollment, those campuses tend to be split in half or gerrymandered. And it's not just the campus itself. As we know, college students live around that campus. And so we've been seeing gerrymandering to separate and dilute students' voices. And so to that end, our redistricting fellows did phenomenal work this year. They drew and submitted over 900 maps across the country. There was over 100 virtual or in-person testimonies that they did, as well as dozens and dozens of op-eds placed either in college campus newspapers or in the communities where those universities are. So that's a little bit about the work that Fair Election Center does.
Wow, I feel like you're a little like Oprah. You're like, and here's a job here, and here's a job here, and here's a job here. So it's so wonderful to hear about all the opportunities at your organizations and the work that they're doing. It's really remarkable, and we're at such a crucial juncture for democracy. So to hear that you all are doing the work that you're doing is so key. Now that we're here, we'll definitely be watching the chat for some questions, but want to ask you guys a little bit more about digging into the bones of democracy and voting. So I think I'm going to start with, I'm going to switch up the order a little bit. So Raymond, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the various pieces of the fieldwork, some of the registration, education, persuasion, and mobilization, each very different activities? How does APIA and how has some of those been done in the past with your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kim. So Apia Vote has a very holistic approach to voter engagement work. We work with our partners to not only register as many Asian American and Pacific Islander voters as possible, but maintaining contact with them and ensuring that they're not only registered, but they're turning out to vote in every single election. And then once they get to the polling place and casting their ballot, we create systems to ensure that their right to vote is protected. We have a dynamic election protection effort. We partner with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, to staff and manage our API voter hotline. That can be reached at 1-888-API-VOTE. And on that hotline, if voters have any questions about their polling place or if they encounter any issues at the polls, they have a place to call and receive multilingual assistance. That hotline is available in 8 different languages, the languages that we find are most useful in our community. And we are always recruiting volunteers and staff to help manage that hotline. Another issue that we face in our community is mis and disinformation. This is really important to talk about because there is often a vacuum of good information in API communities because there's no language accessible or there's very little language accessible or culturally sensitive information. And because of this, there's been wider problems within the community, allowing disinformation and problematic narratives to spread. And in our opinion, mainstream media needs to do a better job at having a presence within API communities. They also need to work better with existing ethnic media to prevent the further spread of bad information and see that our communities are well informed. And so many of the concepts that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, like democracy or voting rights, they're not that easily understood in the way that we as fluent English speakers might understand it. And so because of that, it can lead to poor translation or misunderstanding, which potentially causes disinformation to spread. So API Vote, alongside other organizations and community leaders in the API space, have been tracking disinformation and problematic narratives on the topics of voting rights and democracy, as well as narratives about or originating from our communities. And the reason we're doing this is to make sure that we're effectively protecting our elections and educating our communities about the need to stay informed and to make informed decisions based on factual information. And the last thing I'll say, Kim, is our community is quickly becoming one of the, our electoral power is growing quickly. And I think that that is illustrated in the 2020 election results, where in the state of Georgia, which is my home state, love the state of Georgia, in 2020, President Biden carried the state by less than 13,000 votes. Meanwhile, over 140,000 Asian American voters cast a ballot. And so clearly, Asian Americans have the potential to be the margin of victory in key races across the country. And so my call to action, my ask to anyone who's watching is to pay attention to our community, to recognize that we are not a monolith. We are incredibly diverse and our needs are important. And if candidates want to continue winning elections, if organizations want to continue being successful in engaging our community, they have to pay attention to our needs. And I'd encourage people to reach out if they have any questions about the best ways to engage the Asian American community.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Really, really appreciate your perspective and all the work that you're doing. I think you brought up some really good points as you were talking about misinformation and disinformation, and that ties so closely into election integrity. And that's one of the ways that some folks on the right have tried to co-opt election integrity to pursue some of these sham election reviews that they call audits, but I can't even justify using that word. But I would love to have Vanessa talk a little bit more about how we protect election integrity and how we take that back and how we communicate with voters about this key issue.
Yeah, thank you so much. So there's a couple different points on this, right? I think we have to acknowledge within our movement that we are behind the ball. The mis and disinformation machine of the other side is up and running full force and is being very successful. A couple ways that we need to be really mindful about engaging are two particular ways. One, just as Raymond said, you got to be in the community and you have to understand what is the vernacular, what is the even the language level, what do people in specific communities know, and what do they not know? And that does not mean that you fly in a bunch of people from Washington, D.C. or campaigns across the country into a community, because that model is not going to work anymore, right? We're in COVID. I know people don't want to hear that, 10,000 campaign and volunteer workers are flooding the city. That is scary. It's also not how we really continue to grow the bench and how we continue to invest in communities, right? So we need to be looking now at how are we hiring from within for these upcoming elections, and how are we making sure that now we are starting to provide voter education. And so at the leadership conference, we have been fighting for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act as well as the Freedom to Vote Act. And it is hard on a lot of us to continue to juggle all these balls. And so even my own team and myself, I'd wish that we'd started voter education earlier. It's really so that's difficult, right? And so we need to start thinking about what are creative ways to start doing that. And that includes for many of our communities, like using WhatsApp, right, as a voter education tool, being thoughtful about how we use social media, including Instagram and Facebook, Twitter, right? Just being really mindful and creating an ecosystem that almost feels as a truth serum for some of the things that are happening on the other side, the opposition side. The other piece about this is intersectionality. So when we talk about how to defeat some of these things, how to talk to voters, right, we need to be thinking from an intersectional lens, in that it's not just voting, right? It's like every 4 years, we have organizations and companies running multi-million-dollar campaigns on voter registration and to get people to the polls. And that is amazing and fantastic. But what we have to start doing is breaking apart that timeline so that we can start to really say, look, you got to continue to vote, whether it's for school board, whether it's for city council, right, up and down the ticket. And we got to make sure that people understand, right, when you think about issues that are impacting everyone in your community, it's not going to happen just every 4 years. And so in particular, when you think about things like driver's licenses, right, and at the state level, who regulates that and what does that look like? Not allowing a trans brother or sister in the community to be able to change their pronouns and their identification on their driver's license and then you layer that in with extremely strict voting and voter ID laws, you have essentially taken away the opportunity for that person to vote, right? Because they are not allowed to show up as themselves in their full self and vote. And that is something that we really have to be strategic in looking at. And we have to think about, how are these policies impacting one another? And how are we really speaking to it, right? You know, again, when you think about how the fight against abortion really started to wage, and it was at the local level and it continued to grow, right? We had health community boards, we had hospital boards, right? These types of things that started to impact when they started to think about ways that they could start to shut clinics down. And now we're at the Supreme Court. Well, not now. We're always at the Supreme Court. But we have to be mindful about, as they're moving on one path, right, they're already starting on another path. And that other path is, right, regulating sex education in our schools, health education. Right now, we have this really false war on critical race theory, right? That is something that has been ginned up, and we're starting to lean into. We have to be really mindful. Okay, what are the things that voters need to know actually impact their lives? And what is some of this shiny, glittery stuff that the opposition is trying to drum up? It's not to say it doesn't have a direct impact on lives, but going to the driver's license office, right, to the DMV, and being able to change your pronouns to represent who you really are, versus, you know, social media having a school board screaming about critical race theory, which, by the way, again, is not something you learn until graduate school or law school, right? Which of these things are real, right? And where are we going to put all of our energy, and where are we going to push that, right? But, you know, it's all part of a bigger narrative that they're trying to create. It's all part of that dis and misinformation machine that they've kicked up, and we just need to get better about it. You know, a good reminder, we were blessed to be able to have a presentation by Cornell Belcher at the leadership conference last week. And one of the things that he said that really resonated with people is, yes, Build Back Better is going to be a fantastic bill, right? It's going to help deliver. We are supporting that, right? We're supporting that measure. But also young people, people of color, people who have been historically targeted for marginalization, they didn't march in the streets for bridges and an infrastructure bill. We marched for voting and for justice and democracy. And so that is how we have to continue to take back some of that narrative and think about it really in a bricks and mortar, in a, you know, what are those foundational bricks to build up that argument again, so we're not focused on the shenanigans of the other side. Does that help? Did I answer your question, Kim?
No, that is so wonderful. And I think it was really, really all encompassing. And I think to your point of how insidious some of the other sides' attacks have been when it comes to abortion, or even at the school board level, and in the democracy and voting rights space, we're seeing it. Elections officials at every single level are being targeted with violence, with threats on their life. And that is actually across all parties. Like if they stood up and said that Biden won the election, they've seen attacks. If they didn't want audits, they've seen attacks. And it is a really concerted effort. And frankly, it's not even just about the big lie in 2020. What it is undermining our elections, causing enough doubt so they can change the rules to make it harder to access the ballot, and to make sure that that they are in a place that they can do in 24 what they weren't able to do in 2020. And that's why the work that you all are doing is so important. And I think to that end, Rebecca, would love to hear what your thoughts on these attacks on democracy, and what folks who want to work in this space can and should be doing to fight back and protect this crucial freedom.
Sure. So I would start by saying this is never ending, because when you talk to people who have done this fight in the 50s and the 60s, and when you talk to people who did this fight in the 70s and the 80s, and then when you talk to the people who did this fight in the 90s and early aughts, it's a never ending fight. It's a never ending struggle. And it's one reason why we have to think about the right to vote as every year, every vote. Literally every single year, there are elections in this country. Sometimes we call those years off years, but maybe we need to think of them as non-federal voting years. But every single year, there are sheriffs who are being elected across the country. There are prosecutors and state attorneys. So when we talk to people who are interested in engaging in our democracy, and they see different things happening like Cal Rittenhouse, or they see things happening like the Arbery trial, we have to let people know and understand that there is something that you could do about it through your voice, through your vote. But you can't just show up in a presidential year. You can't even just show up in a congressional election year. But we have to we have to be very vigilant about fighting every single year for every single vote. And anytime we see anyone in this country being denied the right to vote, we all as a greater community have to stand up and fight. Because today we might be seeing a repeal on older Black folks in Georgia not being allowed to have a drink of water while they're standing in a 12-hour line in Decatur, Georgia. While next year, it's a different group. And so each of our even marginalized communities, we have to stand up for each other, as well as we need our white allies as well to stand up and understand that this is also racial justice when we're dealing with the right to vote, and understanding that like Vanessa mentioned earlier, there are a lot of intersectionalities. We also have to fight for those who are non-binary and being able to have the paperwork that they need in order to be able to be registered to vote as their true and full selves. So we have to see this as a continuum. We have to see this on a spectrum and not just have this in a small box as voting rights, but we have to understand each of the communities and intersectionality of communities that we represent. We have to stand up and show up for each other.
Well, I don't think that I could end on a more powerful note than that. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank the three of you for joining us today, for sharing your stories, and honestly, for all of the work that you're doing. We are at such a critical juncture for democracy. And as you said, Rebecca, this is a fight that keeps on going. So I hope that you will all get some rest and come back into the new year refreshed and ready to continue these fights on to the next election. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you do. And thank you for everyone for tuning in today.